This video is all for the pre-release then. This relates to the pre-release in 2023. Specifically, this one is all about tourism and development in the Cayman Islands. And a shortened version really of this is the Georgetown Revitalization Initiative, is what the booklet is all based around. It would be really helpful if you had a copy of the pre-release booklet in front of you whilst we go through this. There are no copies of the graphs, etc. from the pre-release booklet in this video because of copyright, so you will need to have the booklet in front of you whilst we talk through it. So, to start off, some key information about this booklet and the purpose of the pre-release booklet and what you can expect to see in paper 3. So the paper 3 exam is on Friday the 16th of June. It's an hour and 15 minutes long and it's totaled out of 76 marks. Within that, you'll have a section on the pre-release booklet, you'll have a section on geographical skills and generic fieldwork, and then there'll be a section on your own 2 fieldwork trips. The trip that you did to Milford-on-Sea and to Lyndhurst will be the bits that you write about towards the last bit of that paper. So, I suppose the whole point of this pre-release booklet is to think about, well, why do you want to bother looking at it? And why do you need to bother revising the pre-release booklet? The most obvious answer here probably is just to save time. But the more you look at it, the more you can sort of get a feel for the sorts of questions you may well be asked. So they might ask you some questions relating to how you understand data and how you interpret graphs. You know where exactly the information is, which is really helpful for when you're lifting it for those 1 and 2 mark type questions. And also you need to start thinking now, I think, about your own opinion and what you think about this brand new initiative and the new port and whether you think it should be developed there or not. Because ultimately that's what's going to sort of frame your answers and that's what you're going to be asked to write about in this exam. So if you open the pre-release booklet and you go to pages 2 and 3 and you look at figure 1, figure 1 is sort of all about tourism and development and sort of gives us a generic overview of tourism on a global scale, and then it sort of zooms in a bit more and thinks a little bit about cruise tourism. So for example, towards the top of page 2, there's a white box that talks all about tourism, and then there's some information in the blue boxes and a graph about who relies most on tourism. So I suppose we'll start there and we'll sort of zoom in there. So tourism, you might argue on a sort of global scale, is important to a country for sort of the 4 reasons, and the 4 reasons are in blue here. So it's helping create job opportunities, it's generating income, it's having a really positive effect on the balance of trade, and we can sum all of that up and basically say, can't we, well, the more development we've got and the greater development is, in theory, the better quality of life you've got. So for the Cayman Islands, they're really interested in developing their tourism because they want to improve quality of life and they see everything that comes with it as sort of a real benefit and a sort of a big boost to the economy. If you're thinking about sort of quality of life and boost to the economy, you've got to be thinking about the multiplier effect. This is something I think is really key for this pre-release booklet, and I would definitely make sure you can explain this before the exam. So the multiplier effect is the idea that one good thing leads to another and so on and so forth. So for example, with the multiplier effect that I've done here, I might say, well, first comes increased investment, so perhaps putting a bit of extra cash into tourism. So then it's going to generate new industry for us. So then we're going to start to see increased jobs and more tax being paid into the local economy. Remember, it can be local people as well as tourists paying that tax. So then we're going to start to see some investment in schools and healthcare and infrastructure as this new increased revenue from tax starts to be spent. And so therefore, we'll end up with an improved quality of life. And then this whole cycle starts again. So if now I've got an improved quality of life and I've got people that are really happy and they're earning cash and there's quite a bit of investment, well, even more industry is going to be generated and even more jobs, and therefore greater investment again comes back to schools, education and healthcare. So quality of life therefore goes up again. So the multiplier effect is a really positive effect that you can have within a society or within a country, and tourism here could kickstart the multiplier effect for the Cayman Islands. So it's important in the exam that you sort of explain this and you bring it back to this, because I think this is one of the best bits. If you sort of unpick the booklet and look at all these positives, they're sort of building on each other, aren't they? And therefore that is evidence of the multiplier effect. Another key group then that are talked about quite a lot in the pre-release booklet are the World Travel and Tourism Council. And I've shortened that here, you'll probably see, to the WTTC. It does that in your booklet as well. Remember, you can abbreviate things or shorten things in the exam, providing you've written them out once in full. therefore it's fine to do so. So in this video, I'm just going to refer to them as a WTTC for argument's sake. So in the booklet, it tells us all about the tourism sector and how the tourism sector accounts for 13.6% of the total world economy. That's pretty mega, I think. And then it's got 9.9% of all jobs. So if we sort of break this down a little bit more, if I think about a typical LIC or NEE, well, 20% of the total income's coming from tourism. And if I compare that to the UK is only getting 3.7%. So you might argue, well, actually, for tourism on the whole, remember, we're thinking global scale here at the moment. Well, for those like LICs and NEEs, they stand to gain quite a lot by investing in tourism. If 20% of their total income is from tourism, for them it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it, to keep investing in tourism. For us in the UK, with only 3.7% of revenue coming from it, we might argue, yep, it's okay to invest in it, but we're not making that much cash from it. So maybe for argument's sake, it's not as good or it's not advisable for us to invest here. If you have a little look towards the bottom of that booklet, there's sort of a beautiful graph, isn't there? And the graph shows us a few things. The graph I'm referring to is the one that says international tourist arrivals by world region. It's the one with the white background. So reading data and interpreting data and graphs like this carry what we call AO4 marks, so geographical skills marks. So it's highly likely you'll be asked to analyse or read some data. And so all I've done here is start to think about big trends and things that I can easily pick out from the graph. So if there was a 2-mark describe the data question on this graph here, I might make the following points like I've put here. So the top 2 where tourism seems to be growing the most rapidly is happening in Europe and it's happening in Americas. However, in 2005, I think this is pretty key, there seems to be a sharp increase in tourism in Asia and the Pacific. So if that was a 2-mark question for analyse the data, those 2 points there would be more than enough to get me the marks. Now, if I look at that list to the right-hand side, the list to the right-hand side in your booklet is all about the top 20 destinations that are most reliant on tourism for their income. Now, if I was to highlight out of those top 20 destinations any places that are within the Caribbean, 10 out of those 20 are within the Caribbean. So you might say, well, 50% of these destinations most reliant on tourism for their income are actually within the Caribbean. Again, if I look at these places, well, one trend I might pick out is these are all relatively small islands. There are no big countries within that list as well. So again, if I'm asked to analyse the data, those might again be 2 trends I'd make. 1, 10 out of 20 of those are within the Caribbean. And 2, my second point would be the majority of these locations are relatively small. They're small islands. So if I keep going then, and I turn to page 3 in the pre-release booklet, there's another graph right at the top of the page. Now, you might be asked one of 2 things here. You'd either be asked to analyse the data again, and in which case I would do a comparison between 2009 and 2019. So I might say, well, in 2009, there are approximately 18 million cruise passengers, whereas in 2019 or 2018, there's approximately 30 million passengers. The other thing you might be asked to do here is to plot some more of this data. So they might give you some up-to-date data, perhaps from 2023 or 2022, and ask you to plot the next bar on the bar chart. Therefore, it would be advisable to make sure that you have got a ruler and a pencil with you. The examiner will not be accepting graphs that are drawn with wonky lines and that are drawn inaccurately. So if you do it in pencil, worst comes to the worst and it does go wrong, at least you have the opportunity to improve on it and to change rather than having one shot if you've only got a pen. So the bit below this graph in the pre-release booklet then says cruise industry overview, and this is quite important. So we know the Caribbean has got a third of this industry, okay? However then, it's worth about $130 billion. It's creating jobs that are worth $50 billion in wages. That's back in 2019. So why are we really interested then? Why are the Cayman Islands wanting this? Well, they've got 50 new ocean-going cruise ships that have been commissioned to be built by 2025. So if it's already worth $130 billion and it's got jobs that are creating $50 billion worth, and now you're about to add another 50 cruise ships to this, the Cayman Islands here are really looking to cash in on this new demand for tourism. And therefore, if they want to cash in on this new demand for tourism, they're interested in the money side of it, aren't they? And this at the moment is worth big economic gain. So actually you might say, well, perhaps they are wise investing some of their cash here because they stand to gain huge amounts from it if it is successful. And notice that if it is successful bit, that's the bit ultimately, isn't it, you're going to be asked to weigh up in the exam. So the tourism minister has got a lot to say about this, and they're sort of weighing up and starting to weigh up why some of this might be beneficial and why you may well want it. The bit that I think is most important is within that speech bubble, and they're starting to give some sort of hints as to why you might want it. So improvements in things like safety, health and hygiene. Tourism could improve facilities for local people. We've got taxes being spent, improvements on quality of life. All comes back to that multiplier effect that we were talking about at the start. So we've already identified that that's a positive. But the numbers towards the bottom of page 3, I think, are another opportunity for you to be asked some geographical skills questions in the exam. Note it says, for every $1 spent, you've got $1.6 being spent by long stay visitors. So a long stay visitor is somebody who flies in, spends about a week there on holiday, so they're spending quite a bit. Then you've got $1.2 by cruise ship visitors. Now cruise ship visitors are typically there a day or two. So if you've already got more money from long stay visitors, you might argue, well, why do you really need this brand new cruise ship terminal if you're only getting $1.2 to every dollar from them? Perhaps you'd be wiser spending your money on long stay visitors. That could already be one counter argument to start thinking about. Then it says, for every $100,000 invested, about 50 new jobs are created within the tourism industry. Every hotel room creates at least one job. So there's potential here, I think, for you to be asked some sort of data manipulation questions. Perhaps you might be saying, well, they're looking at putting in $600,000 investment into the tourism industry. How many jobs is this likely to create? It's all sort of simple math stuff, which is made even easier if you take a calculator into the exam. But I would expect to see some type of questions like that, given the amount of numbers and data you've got towards the bottom of page 3. So perhaps it's worth just having a go at that at home and playing around with a few of the calculations. So you're sort of expecting it then, you're preparing yourself for it to come up in the exam. To the right then, it starts to talk about impacts of tourism and the marine tourism industry. Currently, the marine tourism industry's got 200 million jobs, with 95% of that revenue going back into the economy if it's from ecotourism, and only 20% going back in if it's from an all-inclusive holiday. Ecotourism is tourism that minimises its impact to the environment. It's relatively small scale. It's run by the local people, mostly for the gain of the local people. All-inclusive holidays are normally run by big tour operators and big tour companies, often have their headquarters in countries other than the Cayman Islands, for example. And so a lot of that profit gets paid back to other big HICs where these sort of companies are located. So only 20% of the revenue from all-inclusive or package holidays is going back into the Cayman Islands. So now you might argue, well, perhaps it's even more beneficial to invest even more in ecotourism because a lot of that revenue is coming back to the local people. And therefore you might argue, well, ecotourism here may well benefit the local people and the local economy far more than this brand new cruise ship terminal and these all-inclusive holidays, because typically a cruise holiday would be an all-inclusive holiday. So if we turn over then and we start to have a little bit of a think about what's going on in figure 2, figure 2 now is starting to make the argument about why the existing port isn't fit for purpose and what this brand new port development is going to do. So the existing port at the top of figure 2 there, so now I'm on page 4, has got a lovely little table in it, again with some data. So I think you could be asked to plot some of this data. We've sort of talked about those sorts of questions, so we're not going to dwell too long there, but again, be expecting it. Then it sort of tells you about the existing port and why this really isn't fit for purpose. So in short, the existing port is a cargo port. It's full of shipping containers and cargo, so it's predominantly an area that's used for trade. And so currently tourists that are arriving in the Cayman Islands are having to walk through this big old port with loads of shipping containers. It's not very aesthetically pleasing, so it doesn't look particularly nice. And so they all want to jazz this area up a little bit and they want to build this brand new port to sort of pull even more people in and to make it look all singing and dancing, really, don't they? So as with all case studies that we would do normally within geography, it's always worth, again, just bear in mind your location description and thinking about exactly where these places are. You'll obviously need to explain this in the exam, and it would be worth explaining in the exam. You could be asked, for example, to explain why the Cayman Islands would be an appropriate tourist destination, or why they should invest there, or what potential impacts of tourism might be. And so having a location description would be mighty useful. The map that's on the screen then would be sort of one such way of doing that. For those of us that haven't already had a little look, Georgetown and the area that they're looking to put this brand new cruise ship terminal in is just over here, so to the west of the islands. But obviously you've got quite a bit of exploring to do, haven't you, if you're a tourist and you're going here. The main airport itself is located not too far across the island. And obviously you've got the nice big beautiful bay as well. So huge tourist attractions here. Loads of beautiful wildlife and scenery. Again, lots of local culture to get stuck into. So it does really pull in the tourists. If you look towards the booklet now is starting to dwell a little bit about why people would want to go there, the sorts of tourist arrivals you've got, and why bother to visit the Cayman Islands. Most importantly, there's another little graph and it talks a bit more about the trends, sort of why people are going there and what's going on. Well, if we look at sort of the trends and the graph with the imports and the exports, we can notice that sort of imports, I'm talking about the table here, is sort of steadily increasing, whereas the amount of cruise passengers here seems to be a massive rapid growth. So actually now, the cargo port and that top box that we were just talking about is very unsuitable, isn't it? It's almost unsustainable. If tourism continues to grow at the rate that the data in the table is suggesting to us, then actually we are going to run out of space and we're not going to be able to cater to all of these people. So you could argue, well, if we keep looking at the trends and the data that we've got here, tourism is likely to outgrow this cargo port and put even more people off if nothing's really done about it. So this brand new terminal that's sort of being proposed sort of goes about the following things, doesn't it? It wants to try and reduce disembarking time. It wants to create opportunities for the local people, but also have huge pull factors, so factors that draw people in and make them want to get off the boat here and come and dock within the Cayman Islands. It wants to move the tourists further away from the trade. It's going to argue here that trade is sort of putting them off a little bit. The whole sort of platform, if you like, for this brand new pier is going on 7.7 acres of reclaimed land. So they're going to reclaim this land and use the dredge material to build it. And if they don't do anything, the local government's arguing, well, visitors could fall up to 50% if they don't spend this cash and they don't invest now. Now, obviously, with that does come a few issues, doesn't it, in terms of the environment. And so if you're building this, you might argue, well, the visitors that are there are the long stay visitors that come for sort of the peace and the environment and they come to see the abundant marine life. Well, lots of that potentially could be threatened by these brand new cruise ship terminal and the fact that it's going to be dredging the coral reef up to a depth of 10 metres to be able to accommodate these ships. So you might say, well, here you've almost got to, as a really skilled geographer, balance the impact on the environment with the potential impact for the people. And you might argue, well, tourists here stand to gain quite a lot with these brand new 2 piers and the 4 cruise ships that can dock at one time, these brand new shopping and leisure facilities, the new buses and the taxi terminals. So you've got to sort of say, right, all of these really good things, all these huge social and economic opportunities, are they almost coming at cost to the environment? And is the environment here likely to suffer because of all of this? You could argue, well, 5,000 jobs is a really big positive thing. However, you might deter long-stay visitors if the environment's damaged. You might say, well, visitor numbers here typically, the trends are showing us that they're increasing. It tells me that at the top of page 5. However, the amount of tourists that are spending cash within the Cayman Islands is actually decreasing. So hang on a minute, there's almost another counter-argument here, isn't there? Yes, you're going to have more people coming, but they're not spending as much. So now, is it still worth that investment if tourists aren't sort of shelling out the cash and spending the money? You could say, well, these cruise visitors are popping in for one day. However, long stay are there for sort of 8 or 9 days on average. Hang on a minute. Is it better to spend the money on people that are there one day or people that are there for longer, that are coming to see the environment and the natural beauty and the scenery? So your cruise passengers are spending 55% less time there than long stay visitors. So you might almost use that bit more of a counter argument and say, yep, you agree that money maybe should be invested into tourism in the Cayman Islands, but hang on a minute, maybe it should be spent on the longer stay visitors and not those cruise visitors that are sort of popping in for one day perhaps. So if we sort of go to the bottom and we have a little look at the bottom of page 5, it starts to tell us about these Cayman Islands a bit more and why it's such a desirable location. So now they're almost trying to sort of sell you this plan a bit more, aren't they? And sell you the project and say, right, this is why they really want it. This is why it's got to be at this location and nowhere else. Okay, so you can sort of boil down all the information they give you in that sort of little yellowy orangey box, I think, into sort of 4 big key reasons. So the first big key reason you've got is the climate. If you look in the bottom right hand corner, you've got a lovely little graph there. The yellow bars are showing you the hours of sunshine. The red line here is sort of showing you average temperature. Again, just check that you can read it, because obviously you've got 2 graphs in one here. So that might be something that you might want to go away and have a little practice of. Again, if it was a describe the data type question here, could you do it? The other big pull you've got here is the marine life. So this lovely little turtle centre is located there. Lots of people go diving here. So it's got some small businesses that sort of thrive off this marine life and sort of showing it off a little bit. The other big thing you've got is your subtropical forests. So you might argue that this is really lucky because you've almost got the balance between beautiful scenery, but also you've got some more attractions that are going to keep pulling people in. So for example, the forest tours and the trails, for example, you might argue that's really good. And then you can also balance that, can't you, with the culture in Georgetown. So it tells you that the culture in Georgetown here has things like traditional craft markets, for example. So you might argue, well, that's particularly beneficial for tourists, and it's got huge selling points then. So if they were to continue to invest in this brand new port and the port development was to go ahead, you might argue these are the things that are going to try and attract those tourists and pull them in. But you might already say, well, these things are already pulling in the tourists. They're pulling in the long stay visitors that are worth the most amount of cash, for example, to the Cayman Islands. So this Georgetown revitalization initiative, again, I think now is sort of launching even more into the forefront if we turn to figure 3. So figure 3, it starts to talk a bit more now about this creating opportunity and this brand new initiative. So for me, I almost see page 6 as their project plan and what it is they're really going to do. This is the bit now they're pitching to people to say, yep, this brand new initiative and this brand new development should go ahead. On the rest of figure 3, just to summarise, you've got the views of different stakeholders. So these are local people or local groups that have got an interest and they're taking a keen eye towards this project plan, whether they like it or dislike it. We'll talk about that in a minute. It also talks to you a bit about the importance of regeneration. So page 6 has got some of the background information about why, but most importantly, it says exactly what it is they want to do. So previously, we looked at sort of a bit of a picture and it showed us on figure 2 sort of an overview, didn't it? Almost a mock-up of what it would look like. Now, if we sort of zoom in a little bit here onto page 6, we're starting to see on the ground level what really it is they're going to do. So now, if we think we've got off the boat, we're a typical tourist on holiday, the 2 pictures on page 6 are sort of what they're imagining the area to be like. And within that imagined area then, they're saying, well, they're going to improve the living space and business space. So they're trying to create social and economic opportunity here for local people. They're going to build some new buildings, however, they're going to also restore some. So we've got some evidence here of gentrification, so you might argue it's a little bit more sustainable, some element of that plan. They're creating some social pedestrianised areas. So you might argue, well, again, they're trying to balance that impact a little bit on the environment here. Improved lighting and green space. They're trying to make it look safe and appealing, but at the same time look after the environment. So they're trying to put some emphasis here on the aesthetics, the look of the place. They want cycling access here. And most importantly, they're going to transplant some of the coral. So it does say they're going to monitor it and they're going to have a relocation and restoration plan to make sure the damage to the coral reef is kept to a minimum. So you might say, well, yeah, they're going to use these divers to monitor the effects and they're going to work with the local environmental groups to try and look at some of these impacts and maybe do some transplanting. But you don't really know how successful that's going to be, do you? So you don't really know actually, are there going to be any big benefits here potentially to them doing that? Or actually, is it just a waste of time because it's not going to work anyway? Or some people might say, well, they've got to try something. They're trying to invest in tourism because it's worth big money to them. They're making a lot of revenue from it. And this is sort of their big plan and their big way of doing it. And you might argue, well, social and economic opportunity here is almost exceeding a little bit the potential impact it could well have on the environment. And so for that, you might say, well, social and economic opportunity here sort of seems to far outweigh perhaps the impact that there is on the environment. And so the 9 marker will probably ask you something along the lines of, well, to what extent do you think this should go ahead? Do you think the brand new port development should be built? Yes, no, justify your answer. And so when you're doing that, you're going to have to weigh up all of the information that's in the booklet. The most important top tip that I would give you for the 9 marker is don't just rely on figure 3. You'll get marks for going back and using information from figures 1 and 2 because the examiner is looking to see that you've read and you've taken in all the information so far that you've got within the pre-release booklet. And as a good geographer, you're able to come to sort of a sound and reasoned opinion. You're able to back up your ideas with lots of data and therefore come to a sound conclusion. So if we go sort of through the booklet and based on everything we've discussed so far, we'll weigh up the positives and negatives. Hopefully this will help then by coming to sort of some sort of judgment then ahead of the 9 marker. So I suppose one big positive here is we've got the growth of cruise tourism. So we've already talked about sort of the why it's needed and how beneficial it's going to be. And the data is there, isn't it, to sort of suggest that cruise tourism is growing. So actually the Cayman Islands may well benefit here. The other big positive I suppose we can say is you might get more visitors to shore. So now actually, if they're not being put off by the trade and by the big containers as part of the cargo yard, well, if they've got this brand new cruise sort of terminal full of all these stores and it's got all these bright lights and it looks lovely, that's going to encourage more people to get off the boat. So therefore you might say, well, as a result, here we go again with the multiplier effect, we're going to start to see increased trade. So more local businesses. Therefore you might say, well, actually they stand to make a little bit of money here. Then you've obviously got the regeneration of the harbour. So let's put that one in here. So you might say, well, that's almost a social, an economic and environmental opportunity. The other big thing at the moment, currently the cruise ships are having to sort of dock a little bit offshore and small boats are having to go out and sort of ferry people to and fro. So actually you might say, well, you'll have less small boat traffic. And we'll counter that in a minute. There we go. So if we've got less small boat traffic, you could argue potentially there's going to be sort of less accidents, isn't there? The downside of that, if we do the negative for that one straight away, is going to be loss of income, isn't it? For those small business owners that have those boats that rely on sort of that ferrying backwards and forwards, you could argue. Perhaps you might want to go here for your biggest negative, which is going to be damage to coral reefs. You might say, well, what impact is this going to have on the diving industry? Because local wildlife potentially, you could argue, is going to be forced away by this brand new development. You've got increased traffic if you've got more people visiting here. So you might argue, well, the environment here is being impacted again. You might say it's going to be extremely costly. We don't really know. There's no real evidence, is there, so far of them being able to make their money back or where this money is going to come from. So you could argue, well, it's a big cost and a huge outlay, perhaps for not much gain here. You could also argue it's going to deter these long-stay visitors. And those long-stay visitors at the moment, we know are paying about $1.6 to every $1. So they're generating huge amounts of income already for the Cayman Islands. And there's a potential here, really, that they could almost be put off a little bit by all these cruise ship visitors that are now going to be visiting if we've got this sort of brand new terminal going ahead. So if you look at page 7 of the pre-release booklet, it starts to think a bit more about the impacts to the environment, and there's sort of some cuttings here from various different newspapers that are sort of commenting on some of these environmental effects. So if we look at the first one, it starts to talk about the effect this could have on the hawksbill turtle. So already a critically endangered species, it's likely that even more here are going to suffer. So you could say, well, you've got 15 acres of the coral reef that's home to these critically endangered turtles, but now it could well be destroyed to make way for 2 cruise ship docks. You could say, actually, is it worth it? Is it worth then dredging 22 acres of the seabed to therefore sort of change some of the environmental quality of the area? So if we dredge the seabed, it's highly likely that that water isn't going to be crystal clear anymore, might have a bit more of a murky colour to it because you're sort of digging up everything that's on the bottom. And so you might say, well, is it worth it? Is it worth damaging such a big area of the water and of the marine habitat just for this brand new cruise ship terminal when we don't really have any evidence of how much impact that's going to have? Again, you've got all of this business that relies on it. So you've got lots of small local economy businesses, so those diving companies, for example, that rely on the coral reef now that may well have to shut down. So you could argue, well, this new extension here may well not generate the extra income, but it's going to create even more environmental opportunities. And people like environmental scientists and conservationists and local businesses might say, well, the reason why all these visitors are coming here is because the environment is so appealing and it is so attractive. And actually by dredging it and by dislodging some of this marine life and causing so much upset to it, actually it's going to work out losing even more visitors and therefore having no impact at all. So you have stand no chance of making that money back, but also you've caused irreversible damage to the environment. So that could be something you wish to weigh up in your 9 marker. Most importantly, do you look at the local views of the proposed development? So those orange speech bubbles towards the bottom. Again, you've got some views here from the local business owner, you've got National Trust, the Cayman Islands Business Report and the campaign group. So you might say, well, in your 9 marker, if you're asked whether you think it should go ahead or not, you might say, well, you agree with this group of people because, however, you disagree with these people because, or you can sort of see some elements where you agree with certain people but disagree with others. That would be really powerful within your 9 marker, and so it's worth weighing up against the balance of all the information you've got within the booklet. If I'm revising this booklet, the first thing I would do now is do a positives and negatives table for this brand new development, and I would go through the whole booklet and sort of summarise, well, who's for and against here, what are the advantages and disadvantages, because that's ultimately what I think you're going to be asked to write about for that big question towards the end of the paper. I hope this helps, and the very best of luck with your revision.